Imagine you just started your new job. You've only been there for just a week and you just started to get along with your coworkers and getting a hang of things. It's just a job, but you feel like your life is finally starting. Everything is turning out as you hoped. You just got engaged and you're planning out your wedding with your fiance. It's only a few months away, but you're so excited. As you're working the shift, you look at the clock and you notice that it's almost over. Only a few more minutes and you can go home. But as soon as you're about to cash out for the night, you and your coworker watch four men enter the shop with their handguns pointed right at you. You panic. You've never witnessed something like this before. But before you can really think and act, two of the men yell at you and force you and your coworker into the basement where they both tie you up. Your life only just began, but now it looks like it might just be over. Welcome to the Decomposing Flower podcast. I'm your host, Jen, and with me is Kira. In this podcast, we discuss themes of true crime cases, natural disasters, or anything we just find that's interesting or downright disturbing. Today, we're going to be discussing the Hi-Fi murders that happened back in 1970 in Ogden, Utah. I don't know if I said that right. I hope I did. This case is pretty disturbing, so I'm just going to give a few trigger warnings. So, torture, rape, murder, and a little bit of a mention of suicide. Obviously, if anything I say that's wrong, please let me know. Please correct us. Everything I found is just information that's on the internet. So, we're going to go a little back before the case to 1952 on the Isle of Trinidad, where Dale Selby Pierre grew up. Dale was a troublemaker pretty much his entire life. He was always causing fights. He would get caught up in the law, fight anyone who got in his way, and he had a horrible temper and he was a very like compulsive liar. Dale would take anything that he felt was just his or that he just wanted, and if anyone got in the way, he would just fight them or just cause issues. His parents did like try to teach him like right from wrong, but Dale never really seemed to pick up on that, or he just didn't care. I'm not entirely sure. There wasn't a whole lot on his parents because by the age of 17, Dale had actually moved to Brooklyn, New York. And then when he was 21 in May of 1973, Dale had actually joined the United States Air Forces. And then by September of 1973, he was transferred to Hill Air Force Base as a helicopter mechanic. Dale, like I said, was always caught up in crimes, whether it was robbing stores, stealing cars, but he also had become a prime suspect in technically two murder cases. I'm going to talk briefly about one. This is not the actual murder case I'm going to be talking about, but this one's just kind of like the setup. So, on October 1st of 1973, Dale was actually at this man's house. His name was Edward Jefferson. He was an Air Force sergeant and they were just like taping some music, and Edward kind of noticed that his keys went missing, and so he was like, that's really weird. So him and Dale, they went searching through his like house and they couldn't find the keys, but then the next day Edward noticed that he found his keys, and so he kind of like was suspicious of Dale. He was like, that's kind of weird. And so he ended up changing like the locks of his apartment, even like his ignition, and he kind of like supposedly had confronted Dale. And sometime between October 4th or October 5th, Edward was found murdered with a bayonet through his head. And how like Dale
Holy
kind of
shit.
became the suspect is that they had actually found out that Dale was making like duplicates of this key. He was signing it under a name, Curtis Alexander. And although there was like a lot of witnesses to this, there wasn't enough proof to kind of charge Dale with this. So kind of wanted to mention that briefly because that was kind of mentioned later on the case, but didn't really have anywhere to kind of fit this into. But yeah, like he was always kind of like starting shit, and like he never really had friends. A lot of the men that were like on the base just did not like him. They said his attitude was like really shitty. People just did not like him. But he did have one friend who was this 19-year-old guy named William Andrews. William had actually pretty like a normal upbringing. He was like really well behaved. He was well liked. People liked him. And he actually had joined the Air Forces the same year as a helicopter mechanic. So some sources said that William was kind of like more timid and that Dale was a lot more of like the brains, I guess, or kind of like the like he kind of controlled more. So around prior to April 22nd of 1974, which is when the Hi-Fi murders happened. Dale was on bail for car theft from stealing like a car from like a dealership in Salt Lake City, but him and William decided they wanted to rob this Hi-Fi store, which a Hi-Fi store, if anyone doesn't know, it's basically like a stereo kind of shop. And he had been visiting this shop for the past few months. He actually kind of became friends with one of the staff members there, or like kind of acquainted. And so they kind of got this idea. They're like, you know what, we're gonna rob this store and do whatever we can to get it. And if people get in the way, that's their fault. So on April 22nd, Dale and William and like four other guys like all went up to the store. And so Stanley Walker and Michelle Ansley, they were the two staff members that were working this night. And right before they were just about to close, these four men had just entered the shop. They had two white vans that were parked outside, and the other men were inside the vans. And William and Dale had their guns pointed at them and basically forced them to go into the basement, where they ended up tying them up and began to rob the store. So during this time, there was this 16-year-old boy named Courtney Nasbitt who actually he had been there earlier that day because he had to run some errands and he needed a place to park. So he had kind of asked Stanley if he could park in the shop's like parking lot. And Stanley was like, yeah, go for it. And so he was kind of coming there to say, thank you for letting me park here. But as he entered, he noticed he was being robbed. And I guess somewhere down there, he ended up being forced to go down into the basement as well. And so around this time as well, Stanley's father, Orrin, he kind of noticed that Stanley, like, he hadn't come home. It had been a while. And so he told his wife and his other son, like, hey, I'm going to go check on Stanley to see what's happening. Maybe he got held up at the shop. And then on top of this, Courtney's mother, Carol, was also realizing her son hadn't come home from doing errands. And so she went to the shop as well. Now, I don't know if they arrived at the same time, but basically when they both arrived, they were now taken hostage in the basement of this shop. And so Dale and William, they are in the basement with these guys, and the other guys are all robbing the store. And so while all the people are being held hostage, Dale tells William to go get the brown bag. And when William arrives back with this brown bag, he took a bottle out of the bag that was like Coke, but it had some liquid mixed into it. And so Dale tells Orrin to go give everyone this drink, but Orrin's like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to give someone some drink. We don't know what it is. Like, I'm not stupid. And Dale was like, okay, fuck you. And so he ended up gagging him and like tying him up and putting him face down on like the basement floor. And then Dale and William got all the other hostages to sit up, and they told them that this liquid would just be vodka laced with sleeping pills, and that it would be, it'd be over soon. But when they all began to drink it, it caused the victims' throats, their lips, their tongues, and any skin that was around their mouth to burn and blister. And the victims began to like scream in so much agonizing pain as this liquid is going down their throats. They're coughing. So Dale didn't give them vodka laced with sleeping pills. He actually gave them Drano. So Dale and William, being super smart, they thought this would kill them immediately because they had watched this movie called Magnum Force. I've never seen the movie, but in my research, basically there's this prostitute character where she is given Drano and she dies immediately. And so I guess Dale and William thought that this meant that all the victims would die immediately, but they weren't. They were in agonizing pain. They were coughing, screaming. And so they're like, okay, we need to get them to shut up. And so they duct taped their mouths, but that didn't work because they had all these like oozing blisters that was actually preventing the tape from sticking. And so kind of like freaking out at this point, and Dale ends up giving Orrin he's like the last person to get the Drano. But Orrin, since like all this was happening, he was able to like kind of mimic the sounds of like the screaming, and he had taken the drink, but he didn't swallow it. He had like spit it out somehow. I don't exactly know how he was able to do this, if Dale and William were just like in some other section or whatever, but he basically just mimicked the sounds of the screams and the pain. He did like get burns, obviously, but he actually was pretty lucky with this. He became kind of like the star of this, which will make more sense as I go. So, since they're not dying fast enough, Dale's getting like really pissed. So he grabs his gun and he shoots both Carol and Courtney Nasbit in the head. And Dale ends up trying to shoot Orrin, but he misses. And then he ends up shooting Stanley, which was Orrin's son, and that actually killed Stanley, like right there. And then he goes to try and kill Orrin a second time, and he grazes like the back of his head. After he had done this, Dale took Michelle and he dragged her to the back of the basement with like a gun, and he ordered her to get naked and strip for him. And then he told William to leave for 30 minutes. And then during this 30 minutes, he brutally rapes her. After he finished raping her, he forced her to go use the bathroom while he watched. And then he took her and he threw her back where all the others were, and then he had just shot her in the head. Michelle had only been working there for only like less than a week or so, and she was the one that was engaged, and she was apparently like trying to plead for her life, saying like I'm too young to die, but obviously Dale didn't give a shit and he killed her. At this point, William and Dale, they notice that like Orrin is still alive. And so Dale tries to kill Orrin again. He mounts him and then he grabs a wire to strangle Orrin, but he fails again. And so at this point, Dale's getting fucking angry. So he puts Orrin on his side and he grabs a ballpoint pen and he shoves it into Orrin's ear, and then he
Oh my God.
stomps on it. Really disgusting. And so this actually caused Orrin's eardrum to rupture. And then the pen had actually broke and it came out of his throat. Orrin survived that. At this point, Dale and William, I guess they thought he had died, or whatever, but they ended up going upstairs and finished loading up all the equipment, and they stole roughly around $24,000 of like stereo equipment, and then they just left. And so at this point, the only survivors is Orrin and then Carol and Courtney. And it took them 3 hours to be found because Orrin's wife and their other son, they noticed that they hadn't been back. And like apparently this crime had happened over the course of 2 hours. So I don't know if like his wife was like sleeping and then she noticed they didn't come home, because I don't really know why like she didn't notice. I don't know. I don't want to put blame on her, obviously. But so her and their younger son, they end up going to the store to like check it out, and when they come in, they notice it's been robbed and they can hear the screams in the basement. And so Orrin's wife calls the police, while Orrin's son ended up breaking down the door. And it was like, it was very traumatizing because he saw his older brother dead, and I mean seeing all these other things and all the burns. When the police arrive, Carol and Courtney were actually taken to the hospital, but Carol actually died upon arrival, and Courtney, he did survive. He wasn't expected to, but he actually did. He survived his injuries, but he unfortunately had amnesia, which meant he wasn't going to be able to be used in trial, and he suffered brain damage. He did eventually go back to school after being in the hospital for 266 days, and he ended up graduating high school in 1976. But when he went to college, he had to drop out because of his brain damage, and he ended up being on government assistance. He ended up getting married as well, but he suffered chronic pain, and he actually died at the age of 44 in 2002. Don't know exactly how he died. I didn't really go into that, but yeah. But Orrin was basically the only one out of all of like the victims that was able to testify, alongside Courtney's father, who testified as well. So Orrin was able to kind of give a good description of these men because, he was there. And after he had given this statement to like the police, they had put it on the news. And only a few hours later, there was actually an anonymous Air Force employee who called the police and told him that William and Dale had actually confided in him months prior, stating that they were going to rob like the hi-fi shop, and that if anyone got in the way, they would kill them. And I think they didn't think it was serious. I don't know why they didn't report this. Maybe they did, I don't know. A few hours after that, there were these two teenage boys that were dumpster diving at the Hill Air Force Base near the barracks where Dale and William were living in. And they actually found the victims' wallets because they recognized their faces on their driver's license and they had recognized that from being on like the news. And so they call the police and the police end up coming over. They had this detective. His name was Deloy or Deloy. I don't know how to say his name. White. I'm just going to call him Detective White. He believed when he was there that the killers were in the crowd. And so he ended up putting up like kind of like a show while he went through the evidence. There was all of these other Air Force men that were all gathered around this dumpster as he's going through it. And he apparently was like speaking very dramatically as he waved each evidence in the air with tongs. You know, he was noticing that all of the other men just stood there and were just silent as they're watching. But there were these two other men that were pacing and they were speaking very loud and being very like using frantic gestures with their hands. And so he was like, "Oh, that's kind of weird." And they look like the guys that we had a statement from. So they ended up being arrested and then they were taken in for questioning. This detective won an award from the Utah branch of Justice Department for his techniques. Apparently this was like used in like other like FBI academies for like how he did this, which is I thought was very interesting. But the police ended up getting a search warrant and then they found that there was a rental contract for a storage unit. They ended up getting another warrant so they could actually search the storage unit and they had found like a shit ton of products from the hi-fi shop. They were able to use like serial code numbers to match them. And then they also found a half empty bottle of Drano. So they were like, oh, that's pretty obvious. There was actually another man that I didn't really mention. His name was Keith Roberts, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit. He was the one that was in the van, and like there was like three other guys, but their identities were never released. And so I don't know if they bounced or something, or if they just didn't have enough evidence. I don't know. Dale and Keith and William, they were all charged with first degree murder and aggravated robbery, and the trial began on October 15th, 1974. And then on November 16th, Dale and William were convicted of all charges, but Keith was only charged with robbery. And then 4 days later, Dale and William were actually sentenced to death, and Keith was sentenced to 5 years to life. But he ended up getting parole in 1987. He served about like 13 years. And then only like a few days after that, Dale was actually given 3 death sentences, one for each victim. And then around this time, he apparently changed his name. He went from Dale to Pierre because he wanted to like protect his family as well, I guess. But he ended up doing this like hearing where he wanted to like lower his sentence. He started to bring up that he was raised very strict and that he was now a changed man. And he actually stated, and this is like a quote from him: "The crime took a course of its own. It wasn't planned that way. People kept coming and I just panicked. The only way to prevent what happened was to have been moved away from the Air Force entirely. Of course, the alcohol and the pills I was consuming didn't help. Everybody has a limit beyond which they won't go. Drugs, etc., can alter that limit. I tell myself you have to accept responsibility for it. You did it and you were there. You can't rationalize it." But William also had stated that he never saw Dale do any drugs or drink at all. And then
I
Orrin
mean,
would end up.
even then, it's still not an excuse.
Oh, yeah,
Like,
exactly.
at
Like,
all.
it's very like interesting when I see people use that. It's like, okay, even if that is true, you still did it.
Sorry, just a fun little tangent. In Korea, there's actually this rule that if you say you're drunk or that you were drinking, you get a lighter sentence. They're
Oh,
like, "Oh, oh, okay, like, he wasn't in his right mind."
that's actually very interesting.
Mhm. Food
Yeah,
for
because like
thought.
that would make sense, but at the same time, it depends on what the crime is too.
Oh my gosh, yeah, like, I've read cases where, like, it's been, like, murder or rape or but the guy just says, "Oh, yeah, no, I was drinking," and they get, like, maybe, like, 2 years.
That's crazy, actually.
Mhm.
So
Sorry.
Orrin would testify like during this hearing, and he would state that he believed that Dale was a sadist and that he deserved to die. He had said after he shot Carol first, then he kind of went prancing or walking in a manner that I got the impression he was kind of enjoying what he was doing. This has been hard. It's been hard for me to believe I was ever involved with this. My son Stanley's life was taken with 2 shots in Drano. He tried 5 different times to kill me. Each could have been lethal. It certainly changed our lives. He then went on to go on about how he had his younger son was extremely traumatized. He wouldn't sleep in the basement. He would take like a mattress into his parents' room because he was so terrified of being alone. And then his wife was like, apparently she was so depressed that she would just stay in bed all day and trying to forget all of this. And so this case has been like very controversial. So I didn't really mention this because like this is kind of interesting, but so all the perpetrators, like Dale, William, Roberts, all of them, they were black. And so there was the NACP, which is like this campaign for like people of color. And they had campaigned to have their sentence lessened for both Dale and William.
Oh my
They
god.
stated that there was a lot of racial bias because there was the victims were all white and the jury was all white. When I did my research on that, there was apparently a black man that was on jury, but then he got released. But it said that he was released because he actually knew like Dale and William or something like that. So obviously he can't be on that. But basically they were trying to argue that there is, white criminals have done something similar or worse and they don't get like a death sentence, which I do think is very like true. Like that does
Mhm.
happen. And William and Dale, they all tried to say like that they didn't intend to kill, but there were so many witnesses of them saying that they were intending to kill. And so they ended up having this hearing denied, and they kind of didn't really touch base on the racial bias or anything on that. And so Dale and William, they had their thing denied, and then Dale was executed with lethal injection on August 28th of 1987 at the age of 34. He refused to have a final meal, and then he gave all of his money, a whopping $29, to William. And then he was seen like praying and fasting and like reading the Bible. He claimed like he was a changed man now because he's Christian, which feel like so many like people just say they're Christian after they go to jail, and it's very weird. And then his last words were apparently, "Thank you. I'm going to say my prayers." And then yeah, he was put to death. William's death was a lot more controversial because he didn't technically kill anyone. It was Dale, but William did admit to putting like Drano down the victim's throat. So technically, and I mean, he was still a perpetrator. He did try to accuse, like, the system of being racist, and then after, like, Dale's execution, there was a petition for William's execution to, like, not happen, but the judge and the court, they denied it. They said it wasn't racially biased or anything, and then William was now on death row, and his last meal was a banana split. He had it with his niece and his sister. His last words were, "Thank those who tried so hard to keep me alive. I hope they continue to fight for equal justice after I'm gone. Tell my family goodbye and I love them." And then when he was strapped to the chair, he apparently like lifted his head to look at his sister and say, "I love you, bye bye." And then he died at the age of 37 on July 30th of 1992. And so Keith, he was in jail until 1987 for 13 years. He ended up moving to Oklahoma to live with family. And then a week after William had died, he actually ended up taking his life and dying from suicide. I don't know if it was guilt or whatever, but yeah. So Dale and William, they were very hated in jail. People did not like them in the Utah State Prison. And there was apparently this convicted criminal named Gary Gilmore. Now, I don't know anything about him, but apparently he was saying, "See you in hell, Dale and William," as he passed their cells before being executed. And so that's something to be noted. But so in December of 1996, the Inter-American Commission had actually found the United States had violated an international obligation by denying William a trial free from racial discrimination. Now, I'm just going to kind of leave it at that because I don't want to say anything. I'm white, so it's not my place, but yeah, that was the hi-fi murders. Very crazy case.
That's insane. And,
Yeah.
like, I wish that there's so much focus, and I get that people can change in prison,
Yeah.
but At the end of the day, like, it's they took lives. Their
Yeah.
victims' lives are gone. They didn't get a fair trial.
Exactly. And,
Like,
like, during when he was, like, on trial, Dale, that's when they had actually found out, like, he probably was, like, the convicted killer of, Edward Jefferson, and so that's, like he took, like, 4 lives technically.
yeah.
So
Like, yeah. And especially for them to try to kill, what was his name? Orlo?
Oren?
Oren, yeah.
Yeah.
When they tried to kill Oren 5 different times, does that not show intent for a
Yeah,
first
like
degree?
yeah, because like, if you go to kill someone and it happened like, obviously, if it's not intended and it's like you're in the heat of the moment, still not okay, but you fail over and over and you try and attempt it 5 times, that's you're trying to kill. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah, so that was the case of the Hi-Fi murders. Again, if anything I said was wrong or misinformation, please feel free to correct us and we will see you in the next episode.